I woke up that morning to the sound of a harsh banging on my front door, forceful, insistent, and wholly unexpected. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled out of bed, confusion clouding my brain. I pulled open the door, bleary-eyed, to be met with the cold, emotionless gaze of two uniformed officers. "Are you Jake Peterson?" the taller of the two officers asked, his stern voice echoing in the silent hallway. "Yeah, that's me. What's going on?" I asked, my heart thundering against my ribcage. "Jake Peterson, you're under arrest for the robbery of Sundale Jewelry Store. You have the right to remain silent." His words faded into a blur as reality began to warp around me. "What? I didn't. There's been some mistake. I didn't rob any jewelry store." I attempted to protest, my voice raw with disbelief, but my plea fell on deaf ears, lost amidst the cacophony of panic threatening to rise within me. In the back seat of the cop car, I rolled the events of the past hour around in my brain like a bad dream, unwilling, or perhaps unable to comprehend them. Robbery. I couldn't remember the last time I'd so much as stepped foot in a jewelry store, let alone robbed one. It was ludicrous, absurd, and yet I found myself handcuffed and being driven to the police station. As I sat in the interrogation room, my mind started to put together the pieces of this inexplicable puzzle. Who could have set me up? And why? The list of people who would want to harm me was sadly short. Then, a cold chill ran down my spine. A niggling thought at the back of my mind coalesced into a horrifying theory. Daniel.E. My stepbrother Daniel. The golden boy. The one everyone loved. The one who was never enough in my father's eyes. Daniel, who'd always been envious of me. The realization was like a punch to the gut, squeezing the breath out of my lungs and leaving me feeling nauseous. But it made sense. Daniel was the only one who had a reason to do this, to get me out of the picture. His motive was clear, but the question remained. How did he pull it off? It took 3 torturous days before I was granted bail, during which I was completely cut off from the outside world. Once I was out, though, I knew I had to act fast. If Daniel was behind this, I had to prove it before it was too late. But how was I going to expose him? As I pondered my next steps, a plan took shape in my mind. To expose Daniel, I'd have to play smart, be strategic. I contacted an old friend, Michael, a private investigator. Over the course of our conversation, we planned a sting operation, one that would, hopefully, reveal Daniel's true colors. But as the days turned into weeks, I couldn't help but feel a deep pain in my heart. If my suspicions about Daniel were correct, our family would be ripped apart. The thought of betraying my brother, of exposing his malevolence to our parents, it was a heavy weight to bear. Despite the emotional turmoil, I kept pushing forward. The alternative was spending years in prison for a crime I didn't commit while my stepbrother walked free, our parents none the wiser to his dark deeds. I was terrified, but I knew I had to fight back. As I lay in bed that night, the full weight of the situation crushing me, I felt an overwhelming surge of sadness. How had things come to this? How had our brotherly love morphed into such a twisted game of betrayal? The tears trickled down my cheeks as reality bore down upon me. Could I really do this? Could I really tear our family apart? Or was the alternative, letting Daniel win, even worse? I was lost within the labyrinth of my thoughts, hopelessly entangled in this web of lies and deceit. But there seemed to be no other way. The days ahead promised nothing but tension, anguish, and a desperate pursuit of truth. All I could do was brace myself for the storm that was about to come. My suspicions had been growing for some time. My stepbrother, Mark, had always been jealous of me. I was the star athlete, the straight-A student, Mom's golden child. Mark, on the other hand, lived in my shadow, always second best. But when I found myself falsely accused of theft, An accusation that could throw my promising future off track. My thoughts kept circling back to him. Could Mark truly be so desperate for recognition, for attention, that he'd sink to framing his own brother? It was time for me to dig deeper. In the following days, I spent most of my time hidden away in Mark's vacant room. Every note, every receipt, every scrap of paper, I scanned for signs of his guilt. I started noticing things that I hadn't before. His recent behavior changes now seemed sinister. His avoidance of eye contact, his nervous twitch when my accusation was mentioned, how he'd stutter when speaking to me, as if concealing a secret. One day, while rummaging through his desk, I found a pawn shop receipt dated the very day before the stolen items were reported missing. My heart pounded in my chest. Could this be the evidence I needed? But the idea of exposing him filled me with dread. This was my family, my home. If Mark was indeed guilty, I would be tearing it all apart. Yet, I was defending my own innocence, my future. Every step towards the truth felt like a betrayal. The emotional weight was unbearable. But I knew, to move past this, I had to expose the real culprit, even if it was my own brother. I decided to plan a sting operation to force the truth out of him. It was a bold move, and perhaps reckless, but desperation had taken over. I schemed for days until I had the perfect plan. I would confront him with the receipt and gauge his reaction. If he was guilty, I hoped that the shock might force a confession out of him. Days turned into a week, and finally, the day of the sting came. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, painting stripes of light on the breakfast table. Mark sat across from me, munching on his cereal, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit him. I took a deep breath, reaching into my pocket to pull out the damning receipt. "Mark," I said, my voice steady, "I found this." His eyes fell on the receipt in my hand. I watched closely as his expression changed from mild curiosity to confusion, and then fear. "Where did you find this?" he stammered, his eyes darting between the receipt and my face. "In your room," I stated, trying to keep my voice calm. "Did you sell these items at the pawn shop?" His face turned ghostly pale, and he began to shake his head, but no words came out. He was caught, and he knew it. But instead of feeling relief, my heart dropped. The fact that Mark had actually done this was crushing. I'd gained my vindication, but at what cost? Looking at Mark, I saw not just a guilty man, but a broken one. Consumed by jealousy and resentment, he had been driven to this desperate act. Suddenly, my stepbrother wasn't just the villain in my story. He was a victim, too, of his insecurities and our family dynamics. Our confrontation sent shockwaves through our family. Although there was relief, the tension was palpable. The bonds that held us together were straining, and I was the cause of it. The irony of it all, the accused becoming the accuser, was not lost on me. I wondered if it was worth it. My future might be safe, but my home would never be the same again. I knew the road ahead was going to be tough, but this was a wake-up call. It was time to address the fissures in our family, heal the wounds, and move towards a future where no one would be driven to such desperation. But first we had to survive the fallout, and that was a story for another day. As the sting operation rolled out, I could feel my pulse thrumming in my veins like some macabre metronome. Time seemed to contort, stretching each second into heart-trembling suspense. My insides twisted with anxiety, and I pondered the moral dilemma I'd so recklessly flung myself into. I was on the brink of tearing my family apart, exposing my stepbrother's treacherous betrayal in the most public of stages. A wave of nausea swept over me, not born from fear, but from the heavy burden of the impending truth. The operation's mechanism was relatively simple. My plan required placing my stepbrother, Brad, in a situation where he would be tempted to betray my trust once again, and this time, I'd catch him red-handed. Covertly, I had positioned the chess pieces, carefully placing bait, setting traps, and ensuring that all of his actions would be caught on hidden cameras. But as the trap began to unfurl, the reality of it all hit me hard. This was my family I was potentially tearing apart, the ones I'd spent countless Christmas mornings and Thanksgiving dinners with. Brad had always been the golden boy of the Davis household, doted on by my father and stepmother alike. His striking resemblance to our father made it difficult for me not to resent him, particularly after he'd framed me. Yet, as much as I yearned to expose Brad's true colors, I couldn't shake off the guilt, the uncanny sensation of dismantling my own home. The tensions within our family had already begun to rise, evident in the wary glances and hushed whispers at the dinner table. Suspicions were kindled, trust waned, and our once tight-knit family was slowly unraveling. Our stepmother, Elaine, seemed most on edge, her hands trembling as she poured coffee or diced vegetables. I could see her stealing worried glances at Brad and me, her brown eyes filled with an unease she tried hard to conceal. One evening, as I ascended the staircase after dinner, I overheard a heated conversation between my father and Elaine. "Something's going on with those boys, Frank," she pleaded, her voice quivering with distress. "They're not themselves. They've been so secretive." I paused, leaning against the banister, the timber cool beneath my anxious grip. These were the ripples I had caused, the aftershocks of my retaliation. I could feel the acute stab of guilt like a physical pang. Yet, I reminded myself why I was doing this. The crime Brad had pinned on me wasn't petty. He'd planted evidence that I'd stolen valuables from our father's safe in order to pay a gambling debt. I'd never even picked up a poker card in my life. The accusation had shattered me. The betrayal had cut me to the quick. But what was worse was the moment I looked into my father's eyes and only saw disappointment, not the warm, trusting gaze I was so familiar with. The pain of that betrayal, that soul-shattering moment when I'd been deemed guilty without a shred of defense, it had fueled my operation. Yet now, as the family I cherished hung in the balance, I found myself teetering on the edge of uncertainty. Retreating to my room that night, I stared at the darkened ceiling, my heart pounding erratically. The moral quandary tightened its grip around me, choking me with its relentless intensity. Was I going too far? Was my quest for vindication worth the cost? My thoughts drifted back to Brad, the brother I grew up with, the brother who betrayed me. I realized that my sting operation was more than just about redemption. It was about the truth. It was about shattering the illusion and confronting the reality, as harsh and as damaging as it might be. As dawn crept over the horizon, I steeled my resolve. I couldn't back down now. I had to expose Brad, for the sake of truth, for the sake of justice, and more importantly, for the sake of our family. The tension in the room was so thick, you could cut it with a knife. It was in the stern faces of my parents, Ann and Jim, and it was in the stunned silence of my stepbrother, Brad. I had set up this little family gathering as a reunion, a celebration after my release from prison. A crime I never committed but was framed for by none other than Brad. "What is the meaning of this?" Anne's voice trembled as I finished my impassioned speech. I just laid bare the entire scheme to them, how Brad had manipulated evidence and cajoled witnesses to testify against me, how he'd let his own brother languish behind bars while he squandered our parents' money and tarnished the family name. Jim's face had gone from disbelief to shock, and then to hard, stony anger. Anne was crying, her face buried in her hands. Brad, however, sat silent, watching us all with a confused expression. I knew he was calculating, trying to find a way out of the mess he'd put himself into. A knock at the door punctuated the tense silence. I kept my gaze locked on Brad's as I called out, "Come in." The door opened, revealing a tall man in a navy blue suit. He was familiar to me, but not to my family. This was Detective Adams, the sympathetic cop who had believed in my innocence when I was arrested. Following him was Laura, the poor girl Brad had paid to falsely testify against me. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face a mask of raw shame. "Brad," I began, my voice steely. "Meet Detective Adams and Laura. They have something to share." Brad scoffed. "What is this? Some pathetic attempt to frame me?" He spat, but his eyes flickered nervously from Adams to Laura. Detective Adams cleared his throat. "Brad," he said, "Laura here has confessed to making a false testimony against your brother. She has given a complete statement and wants to apologize." Laura stepped forward, her gaze lowered. She mumbled a sorry, her voice shaking. It wasn't me she needed to apologize to. It was to herself. She was just another one of Brad's victims, lured by his charisma and trapped by his deceit. The room was pin-drop silent for a moment before Brad finally exploded. "This is all lies. They're trying to frame me." "But we have proof, Brad," I calmly said, showing him the recorded conversation between him and Laura, where he instructed her on what to say during my trial. Brad's face turned pale. He looked desperately at our parents, but their faces were stricken, their trust in him shattered. I didn't mean," he stammered. But his words were drowned in the deafening silence of his guilt. My heart was heavy as I watched my family torn apart by the revelation. I could see the pain in Anne's watery eyes, the anger in Jim's clenched fists. My victory was bitter, tainted by the hurt that my own brother had inflicted upon us all. "This isn't the end," Brad muttered, standing up abruptly. His face was a storm of anger, denial, and fear. But to me, it was the final step of my carefully orchestrated plan. It was his fall from the pedestal he had placed himself upon, and the shattering of the illusions he had built around himself. The climax of my plan was just as I had envisioned, but it was not a moment of triumph. It was a moment of profound sadness. It dawned on me that the real climax wasn't exposing Brad or proving my innocence. No, the real climax was the realization of the depth of betrayal and the toll it had taken on our family. Watching Brad being led out by Adams and sobbing into Jim's chest, I realized that even though I had exposed the truth, it had done nothing to mend the deep fractures in our family. The satisfaction of revealing Brad's guilt was overshadowed by the devastation it caused. It was a victory, but it tasted too much like defeat. Having unraveled the layers of deceit, having unearthed the cunning treachery put forward by my own flesh and blood, by Alex, my stepbrother, I stood amid the bare starkness of reality. The silence rang loud in my ears. The bare white walls of our family living room felt colder than ever before. "Is this true, Alex?" The question, barely a whisper, slipped from my mother's trembling lips, her gaze flittering back and forth between the two of us. Alex's face, once the picture of smug arrogance, now resembled a startling mix of fear and shock. For a split second, I saw a glimmer of regret flash across his features. Or perhaps it was the realization that the game was up. His betrayal brought forth for everyone to witness. "Yes, Mom, I did it," he admitted, lowering his head, seemingly in shame. A collective gasp filled the room, drowning out the ticking of the grandfather clock that once seemed so commanding in the room's silence. Aunt Martha's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes welling up with disbelief. "Alex, how could you?" My father's voice echoed throughout the room. The disappointment in his tone was chilling and louder than any words could convey. The admission tore through the room, slicing through the fabric of our family like a butcher's blade. The bitter taste of betrayal hung in the air, making each breath painful. The realization that Alex, with his disarming smile and charismatic allure, was the architect of my downfall was too bitter a pill for our family to swallow. His fingers played nervously with the hem of his shirt as he stuttered. I didn't mean for things to... His voice tapered off into the damning silence. "No, Alex," I broke in, feeling an unfamiliar surge of bitterness. "You don't get to backpedal now. You wanted this. You wanted me. Me to suffer, to pay for a crime I didn't commit. Anguish choked me, blurring my vision as the reality of his betrayal sliced through the heartstrings binding me to him. My own brother had been the architect of my undoing, had reveled in my downfall. And for what? A fleeting sense of accomplishment? A perverse desire to see me broken? The room lapsed back into silence, as though giving us space to grieve, to mourn the loss of the innocence we once held. We were a family shattered, torn asunder not by external forces, but by one of our own. The implications were devastating, the wounds deep and searing. Yet, there was a bitter kind of solace in the truth, even if it was a truth we could have lived without. The festering wound of uncertainty had been replaced by the sharp sting of betrayal, and somehow it was better. Better to know the knife's edge than to fear its strike. It's strange how the pursuit of truth, this relentless quest for answers, weaves such intricate webs of consequence. I had sought truth and justice, little realizing the price I would pay, the frayed bonds of family, the brittle shards of trust that now lay scattered at our feet. We sat there, a tableau of regret and loss, our breaths shallow, our hearts heavy, each lost in our own thoughts, each dealing in our own way with the shocking revelation, the heart-rending betrayal. There was no way to go back, no way to undo the damage done, the trust broken. The stark reality swallowed up the last vestiges of our normality, leaving an impossible emptiness behind. In the end, the quest for truth had indeed led me down a path fraught with tribulations, teeming with unforeseen consequences. But in its wake, it left me with an invaluable lesson, one that would shape the rest of my life. Truth, in its purest form, can be both a balm and a blade. It can mend the deepest wounds or inflict the most unendurable pain. And as I looked around at my family, their faces mirroring the storm of emotions raging within me, I realized that this was merely the beginning of a long and arduous healing process. The journey towards redemption, towards rebuilding trust, would be a steep climb. But it was a climb we had to make, each grappling with the shadows of betrayal, each bearing the weight of truth's harsh illumination.